Michael Cathcart is a writer and broadcaster and a historian. In that role, he has until now perhaps been best known for his acclaimed abridgment of Manning Clark's 6-volume classic, A History of Australia, and together with Kate Darren-Smith, he produced the wide-ranging anthology Stirring Australian Speeches. He is also the author of Defending the National Tuck Shop, a study of conservative responses to the Great Depression by the paramilitary movement, the White Army. He has won numerous prizes for his work in the media as well as his history publications. When he hasn't been lecturing at the University of Melbourne, he has been lighting up the ABC as presenter of Radio National daily programs such as Arts Today, in memoriam, Late Night Live, Bush Telegraph and the famous Radio National Quiz. The blurb for Water Dreamers advises us that Michael's new book is the story of how settler Australians attempted to transform this dry continent and how it in turn changed them. It is, he says, a story of how we learned to belong. This is a story we have all come to hear, and I can't think of anyone more equipped to tell it. Welcome, Michael Cathcart.
Well, thank you for coming on what is a night when there are lots of offerings in Sydney. I do appreciate you coming here to share these thoughts with me. In 1944, the economic historian Aggle Shaw observed that the history of Australia could be written as a struggle to conquer two obstacles: distance and the lack of water. And Geoffrey Blainey's classic, The Tyranny of Distance, published now in 1966, which is appalling to think, took on the first part of that challenge. Now, I believe that Blainey's book is one of the great Australian history books. I disagree with Blainey about lots of things, but he was my teacher at the University of Melbourne, and I read The Tyranny of Distance when I was being lectured by him, and I thought it was wonderful, and I reread it every 5 or 6 years. And you remember that what Blainey did was he showed that Blainey was the factor that determined Australian history, the factor which, in his words, shaped Australian history. Well, after I finished abridging Manning Clark's History of Australia, I was really taken with the idea of the need to write, for myself, to write a general history of Australia. And it was partly motivated by the fact that postmodernism was around. It was the high noon of postmodernism, the early 90s. And postmodernism taught us that you couldn't have a history of Australia, that was something evil called a master narrative. You can hear how bad that is, a master narrative. And we had to have lots of histories. There were histories of gender and histories of women and histories of men and histories of childhood and so on. And of course one appreciates that that is absolutely right. We've got to understand that we live in a land of multiple histories. Nevertheless, being perverse, I wanted to write a history of Australia, partly as a response to the homogenising effect of American globalisation, I guess. And I thought, well, I'd love to find one factor that shaped history in the way Blainey used distance. And it was instantly clear to me, once that was the mindset I had, that I would be writing about water. And as Glenda said, I went to the shores of Lake Eyre. I went to the inland of Western Australia. I went to Oxford, where the Charles Sturt papers are kept. Had an extraordinary experience in Oxford, actually. I went to dinner in an Oxford college. It was a bit like being in sort of Harry Potter movie. You're in a beautiful old dining room and sitting at a high table. And in Oxford, academics fall into only two groups. There are the people who are the most witty and accomplished conversationalists you've ever met. It's like having, lunch with Stephen Fry. It's wonderful. And there are the people who are so cripplingly inadequate that they can't find anything to talk about. So they suddenly go, "Oh my Lord, look at that watch. What an interesting shape that watch is. Yes, it's a very interesting watch." You do that, a lot of that sort of thing. So this woman leans across the table, at high table, and she says, So what do you actually do in Australia?" I said, "I'm a historian." She said, "Yeah. You can't be very busy." I suppose I felt very indignant at the time, and I realised that the reason I was indignant is I felt, we had 200 years of white history, and that was a lot of history. I've come to understand actually how inadequate that response was. Last year, I went on a cruise up the coast of the Kimberley. In fact, this businessman, a powerful businessman, rang me. He said, "G'day, Michael." He said, "I've just heard you on the radio." He said, "I represent a group of very powerful, very rich Americans. Very rich, very powerful. And I'm taking them on a cruise up the coast of the Kimberley. And you'd make a marvellous resource." So I'm thinking, you complete dick. Let him Just keep talking, you pain. And when it was all over, I said, perhaps you could just put this in writing, and hung up and went out and said to my wife, I've just spoken to this, guy, and he wants to... And she said to me, Michael, it's a cruise. And I could see her point, so we went on the cruise. And I was a dutiful resource. And there came a day when we went ashore in little rubber dinghies, and there was a waiter on the shore with Bloody Marys that were distributed to us all in sort of luxury. And then we were taken up a little path into a rocky sort of cave in which there were these extraordinary Wandjina figures. And I stood there looking at these, and I had an incredible sensation that somehow these were part of me. Now, I know that sounds as though I'm trespassing on somebody's sacred business, but I don't mean that. I mean that as an Australian, I felt whatever this is about, it's part of my story, and I felt terribly moved by it. And I realised that the Americans were all gasping away and taking photographs and so on, that it wasn't part of their story. It was just of anthropological interest to them, but this was part of me. And part of the challenge, I think, that we all face, those of us who are settler Australians, is to really believe that our human history goes back 40,000 years. Not that the Aborigines' history goes back 40,000 years, but that the human history of Australians is 40,000 years old. Until we've made that move, we will not truly belong in this land, and we will not truly accept that both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians are all Australians. The human history of Australians is 40,000 years old. It's a big challenge. Every time you think you've got it right, something comes along that says to you, you haven't got it right. There's more to learn. It's one of the wonderful things about being an academic rather than being a politician, where you've got to keep defending positions you probably don't quite hold. As an academic, you can always say, this is the best I've got so far, let me share it with you. Well, this is the best I've got so far on water, so let me share that with you. My premise is that the history of water, the history of Australia, can be based on water, as I say. Since Blaney wrote his book, the world has grown smaller. Distance is not such a tyranny, I don't think. During the same period, the challenge posed by a lack of water has become even more acute. In fact, in the 90s, when I said to people, they said, what do you do at the university? I said, I'm writing history of water. They didn't get it. They thought it sounded esoteric and weird. It's like saying you're writing history of dirt. I mean, history of water, what's that? Now everybody gets it. They say, how interesting, how important. It is the fundamental limit on how we live. It determines where we've established our cities, how we think about country, how we farm it, how we are as Australians. So that's the annual rainfall map, as you know, and it's the most important map we have. It determines everything else about us, and you know what it means. The green bits are where we live and where it rains, and in the middle it hardly rains at all. And when you put it alongside something keeps going wrong. Never mind. There are Aborigines on the coast of Sydney. When you put the Aboriginal map alongside the rainfall map, you'll see the map of Aboriginal territories, that actually where Aborigines lived was also determined by rainfall. Aborigines lived in greater numbers on the coast than they did in the centre of Australia. The map of Aboriginal distribution shows that, but also it must be true because that's where the rainfall is highest. You see, we haven't chosen to live on the coast. We live here because that's where the rain is. You often hear people say, there's something wrong with Australians, they cower on the coast as if they're afraid of the inland. It's got nothing to do with being afraid of the inland. The reason we live on the coast is that's where it rains. We have to live where the water is. If you think about this, the Aborigines were here for 40,000 years. In a wet season, the number of Aborigines increased because old people and babies survived. In a dry season, the Aboriginal population decreased because old people and babies died. So in Aboriginal terms, Australia was full. All the water in Australia was fully allocated. Now, it's easy to believe that when the colonists arrived, if we'd done things differently, we could have all got on. Because there is enough room, enough land for everybody. Well, yes, there is enough land for everybody, but there ain't enough water. The water resources of Australia were fully allocated. And that meant that once the whites arrived with a different agenda, there was going to be a fight. That the violence on the frontier was a war over water, even when explicitly it's not stated as that, simply because the reason there had to be conflict is because there wasn't enough water to go around. Now, And what you make of that, that's a fact. What you make of that is a question of your own moral leanings. On the 18th of January 1788, Governor Phillip, or Captain Phillip as he then was, sailed into Botany Bay, and from the quarterdeck of the ship's supply he could see 40 naked men, or Indians as he said, gathered on the southern beach. They were shouting and making what Lieutenant Watson Tench described as uncouth signs and gestures. Must have been a scary sight. On the opposite beach, however, there was a party of just 12 such Indians, and Phillip decided to take his chances with this smaller group and set out towards them with a group of officers in a boat. The crewmen rowed the boat parallel to the beach for some distance, the Indians keeping pace with her on the sand, he wrote. Each group is watching the other. The Aborigines jog along the shoreline holding their flexible spears. The British officers are sitting up alert with their muskets ready in their red and blue uniforms in the boat. And then, reports Tench, one of the officers makes a sign, "We want water to drink." And the Aborigines beckon them ashore and direct them to a spot where water is available. For Arthur Phillip, a great deal hangs on the next few minutes, perhaps even men's lives. He climbs out of the boat and he steps onto the sand at Botany Bay to meet the owners of that country. According to his account, he approached, quote, with signs of friendship, alone and unarmed, and they readily returned his confidence by laying down their weapons. The other officers clamber out of the boat and they join the men on the beach. One group is strangely dressed. The other group is strangely naked. Then the Englishmen see their mime show through to its conclusion by squatting at the Aboriginals' drinking hole. It's one of Botany Bay's tiny creeks, a run of cool water, gurgling over rocks, shaded by green ferns and melaleuca and tea tree. We can picture those officers, can't we, scooping up the water from their hands while the Aborigines look on warily from about 30 metres away. When the drinking was done, the Aborigines advanced closer as Phillip and the officers clowned about and offered them presents. The surgeon, George Worgan, was in no doubt that these men were still fearful of these intruders. But the water ritual was a kind of communion between the two groups. A day later, another meeting was filled with laughter and comedy and dancing. This initial transaction concealed deep differences of meaning. The Aborigines were engaged in a social exchange they knew well. They had welcomed strangers and they invited them to drink at their water. But when Governor Phillip stepped ashore, his purpose, as Tench saw it, was, quote, to take possession of his new territory and bring about an intercourse between its old and its new masters. So that's the water foundation moment for Australians. The spot chosen for the purpose of settlement was at the head of the cove near the run of fresh water, which stole silently through a very thick wood, the stillness of which had then, for the first time since the creation, been interrupted by the rude sound of the labourer's axe and the downfall of its ancient inhabitants. That's the trees, not the Aborigines. The axe, he goes on, brought these ancient trees crashing down, breaking the stillness and tranquillity which from that day were to give place to the voice of labour, the confusion of camps and towns, and the busy hum of its new possessors. Now, understand what this image is. These settlers thought of Australia as a great and silent continent. They thought of Australia as the silent continent in exactly the same way that the British and the Europeans thought of Africa as the dark continent. The dark continent was there to be illuminated by the light of civilization. So the silent continent was to be brought alive by the sounds of industry. You go into a dark and silent wood, a wood that we believe covers the whole of the continent. We cut down the trees and the trees crash through the forest, shattering the silence and announcing that history has arrived, that progress has begun, that the sounds of industry shall reverberate across this land and create the expectation that valley by valley, hill by hill, civilization will advance into the hinterland of Australia, transforming this silent continent into a place of British prosperity, alive with the sounds of industry. There's the actual shape of the cove. I'm sure you're familiar with this, and there are little pictures of wells there and so on. I want to concentrate tonight on this idea of sounds and silence, of conquering the land with the sounds of civilisation, which is the other sort of theme in the book. It's in the same spirit that Sydney's new Presbyterian minister, the lively John Dunmore Lang, one of my favourite people in Australian history, told his congregation that thanks to them, Sydney had, quote, been reclaimed from the lowest stage of barbarism. He goes on, "It is delightful in those valleys where wild beasts of the forests roam so lately to hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of oxen." Listen to the sounds. "It's delightful on that spot where the rude savage has so lately a boundless solitude upon him to behold a rising city and hear the speech of civilised men." They thought of the Aborigines as living in a kind of limbo, as a silent people, padding about noiselessly in the forest, as if they were living in a different dimension, as if you couldn't hear them. I say in the book they were here but not here. They were here but somehow not heard. The youthful Charles Sturt arrives here in the 20s. And he's equally delighted by the sounds of civilisation. He assures intending migrants from Britain that Sydney Cove is a place where, quote, a flourishing town now stands over the ruins of the forest. He goes on, "He who has never looked on any other than the well-cultured fields of England can have little idea of a country that nature has covered with an interminable forest." See, they thought this wood went on forever. They didn't call it bush, they call it wood. Like in Hansel and Gretel, it's a wood that stands at the dawn of time. "Still less," Sturt goes on, "can he estimate the feelings which an adventurer approaches a shore that has never been trodden by the foot of civilised man." He goes on to say this, "The stillness of that once desert shore has been broken by the sound of the bugle and the busy hum of commerce." I guess I should have been showing that famous picture there. Major James Taylor painted that. It's a view of Sydney in 1821. Now, there are interesting parallels here with American history. I'm very interested in an American historian called Mark M. Smith. And he points out that a similar ideology of hearing can be found in the United States. The Baltimore journalist Hezekiah Niles, isn't that a marvellous name, exulted over the progress of American colonisation by declaring that, quote, "Everywhere the sound of the axe is heard, opening the forest to the sun. The busy hum," there's that phrase again, "the busy hum of 10,000 wheels fills our seaports, and the sound of the spindle and the loom succeeds the yell of the savage or the screech of the night owl in this late wilderness of the interior." So in both countries, the colonists have their ears pricked for the ways in which the sounds of civilisation are replacing the geography that had been there before them. The silence that we get in Australia, the silence is a hallmark of terra nullius because, as I've just said, the silence is what banishes the Aborigines into this zone where they're kind of out of reach of progress. It's often said that terra nullius is the idea that the Aborigines didn't exist. Well, that's nonsense. The Aborigines, it never said that. Terra nullius is the idea the Aborigines were here, but they neither belonged nor did they own anything. They had not possessed the land in a way that British law or even the rule of history could acknowledge. They just kind of, wafted about in a kind of limbo. You know, we didn't learn to use the term terra nullius until the Gove Land Rights case in 1971. But the concept of terra nullius is imprinted on 19th century consciousness, this idea the Aborigines are here, but somehow living in a different tense. They're in a perpetual yesterday. They're not present. They're not present. They're not here in the sense that they're not in the present. It's a kind of paradox, isn't it? They're here but not here, silent, doomed and unchanging. And it links in with that wonderful phrase that W.E.H. Stanner used in the Boyer Lecture of 1968. You know, he talks about the great Australian silence, this absence of Aborigines from Australian history, this silence we have about them. I must say, though, as an Australian historian, when I went back and looked at 19th century sources, I was not prepared for the fact that Aborigines are mentioned by just about everybody who goes out into the interior, because they're the most interesting thing you encounter. The most interesting experience you have is meeting Aborigines. Evidence about Aboriginal life is not as thin on the ground as people would have you believe. The records are full of descriptions of what Aboriginal life was like. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about the silence. As I say, I've got this idea that just as Africa is the dark continent, I think we should think of Australia as I bodged up this book with my name on it. It's just sort of a little fantasy of mine. John Oxley, who's often said to have been a man who believed in an inland sea, in fact is a chap who went off looking for the Great River. He went off, he traced the Lachlan in 1817 and the Macquarie in 1818 under instruction from Governor Macquarie to see if they flowed right across the continent, because he's looking for a great river, not for an inland sea. And when he came back with the news that there was no great river, that there just seemed to be a swamp out there, this wasn't greeted as great news. It was greeted with disappointment, as an act of despair. There was no belief in an inland sea. That's a great myth, that the explorers were looking for an inland sea. They weren't. They hoped for a great river. Oxley is actually the founder of a phrase that I've called in the Water Dreamers the Great Australian Melancholy. Oxley is the one who comes back from the inland and says it's a place of death, a place of silence. He has ridden into the silence. And he's the first person really to report a sensation that will dominate the 19th century. And that is that you have the experience that you've entered the silence and it won't disperse. It doesn't matter if you cut down trees or fire guns or do anything. The silence stays all around you and it fills you with a sense of death and foreboding. And he comes back freaked out, completely freaked out by what he's come face to face with. He's created this sense of death, that the death-like silence is what lies at the heart of Australia. Now, this means that we've now got a struggle on our hands between two views of what Australia is all about. School books, when I was a kid, were full of illustrations like this. This one's from the Australian Encyclopedia of 1958, but it could have been from any school textbook. It's called, Opening Up the Continent. And you can see in the top left-hand corner there's Australia completely black and ignorant with a little white dot, which is Sydney. And gradually, we pass into knowledge. Now, no educational publisher today would publish this. No educational publisher would be so blind to the ideological implications that the black Australia is a place of ignorance and that white Australia is a place of knowledge. You just wouldn't do it. It's this kind of thinking, if we're going to own the whole of our history, we have to get beyond. We have to stop talking like this. Australians knew the whole of the continent and they've done it for 40,000 years. That did not happen. That didn't happen. What that is a graph of what I've called a chart of the geography of silence. And I'm going to keep sort of playing with this idea of silence and then try to show you how it fits in with ideas of the centre and also the idea of water.